Welcome to Physics Can Be Fun with me, Stephen Thomas. Today the question I'd like to ask is, why are South African schools underperforming in the physical sciences? Why? Now, I have taught at good schools and I have had the privilege of observing underachieving schools, and we have schools in South Africa which do fantastically well, 100% pass rate, and then we have schools in South Africa which have a near 0% pass rate. So when you go into the classrooms of these high achieving and low achieving schools, it looks superficially very similar indeed. You won't, just by walking into the classroom, realize or understand if that, or immediately it will not be apparent that that school will do well or badly in the final exam. So what are the subtleties, the subtle things which are different in the high performing and low performing or underachieving schools? So I've given a few things here which I'd like you to consider, and in your own mind tick them off as being very different in the two types of schools in South Africa. Do you think absenteeism is much more rife in underperforming? Well, maybe. IQ of the students, do you think all the clever kids go to the high-performing schools and all the dumb kids go to the underachieving schools? What about work done in class? Is there no work being done in underachieving schools? What about homework? In the one school is homework done and not in the other? What about teachers passionate and want their kids to pass in the school? Do you think that's a vital factor? And do you think it's important if they're passionate about their subject? What about teachers' method of teaching? Do you think it's important if the teachers teach systematically? Do you think that could be a factor? The way teachers teach could be fundamentally different. What about past papers being studied in the high achieving but not in the low achieving schools? Or vice versa? Do you think that's an important factor? What about testing to see if the kids are passing? Do you think in some schools they know the status of the students and in others they don't? And do top achieving schools take remedial action? What about outside support? Do you think at these low achieving schools there's no outside support, such as tutors which come and help them, and holiday camps and outside intervention, school on Saturday, etc.? Do you think that's the difference? Or what about the parents? Do you think parents care in the one school and not in the other? Let's look at a few more factors. Are individuals taught how to solve problems for themselves maybe in the one school? What about practical work? Do some schools do no practical work? What about facilities? Do you think the facilities of the school are the big difference that make the huge difference? What about the qualifications of the teachers? Do you think that's the major factor? What about the learners made to feel inadequate in the one system and adequate in the other? What about the learners being given all the tools before they are asked to solve problems? So that's a learning method. Do you think in some schools the learners are forced to go and ferret out answers for themselves, whereas in the other schools they are spoon-fed? What do you think? Do you think that makes a difference? What do you think the role of the teacher is? Do you think the teacher's role in the passing or failing is important or not? And last of all, do you think there's a history that it's going to take 1, 2, or 3 generations for underachieving schools? The sins of the fathers are visited upon the children. Do you think it's going to take many generations for underachieving to be corrected? Fine, so let's go through them. I hope you've got an opinion on each of these subjects. Let's start with IQ. I think we can quickly exclude that all kids at high and low achieving schools seem to have similar IQs. Absenteeism, well, maybe there's a little bit more absenteeism, but I would consider that a major factor. So I'm going to scratch that out, because at underachieving schools, they often have feeding programs and the kids are incentivized to come to school for their 1 or 2 meals a day. What about no work done in class? If you walk into both types of schools, you will find teaching going on, you will see activity. So that's not a factor. Work is being done in class. Now here, do you think in some schools no homework is given? Well, this is where we're starting to hit rubber meeting road. I have found in underachieving schools, no homework is being done, and it's not checked, and it's not enforced. So this is a very important factor. In both schools, I found that teachers are passionate about the subject. So teachers are passionate in both schools. They want their kids to pass, but if you want a difference, I found in underachieving schools, the teachers do not actually like their subject. They like teaching the subject, but they don't actually like playing with science themselves. Science is something they teach. It's not something that they live, do, breathe, and in their spare time also indulging. So I'm going to say this is not so important except when it comes to the actual love for science. Teachers in both schools are passionate, but in the one school they do love doing science more. What about teachers do not teach content systematically? You know, there's a teaching method. You could almost call it spoon feeding. I like to call it the Socratic method. If you're going to give kids a problem, you give them all the tools to do the problem first. You tell them this is the basic idea, then you give them the formula, you teach them the formula, you teach them how to do the problem, and you do not give them the problem until they have every piece of equipment to do it. Now, this is a teaching method, and I have found that in the underachieving schools, this is probably in my opinion, the most neglected thing, that the teachers tend to abuse the past paper system. Now, past papers are fantastic. If your school's doing well and you give them past papers to do, they will do even better. But in underachieving schools, teachers hand out past papers, kids go and they try and do the past papers without being adequately taught. Now, this leads to feelings of inadequacy because the students are now made to ferret through past papers. They ferret out the answers, very good at that, but they never systematically taught the whole subject. They are not taught from A to B to C to Z, joining all the dots. They cannot, in other words, for themselves, in future, solve any problem in, let's say, electrostatics, or let's say, in work energy theorem. So they can solve individual problems from past papers because that's what they've been trained to do, to go and look for answers in the memos and look for, it's almost like a comprehension way of teaching. The teacher gives them a past paper, tells them to get on with it. The teacher may walk around, or the teacher may sit down and do something else. And kids spend their lives doing past papers, but they're not systematically taught. To me, that's the most important thing, is the teaching method. And I have found that the teachers probably were taught that way themselves, so they think this is the normal way. They don't like to spoon feed their kids. In fact, they think that spoon feeding is wrong. They don't think that they should systematically and thoroughly teach the subject completely. Now, let me tell you that what happens when you teach the subject systematically and completely. When a kid now faces a problem, he has got everything he needs to know to solve that problem in the good schools. So what does the kid do? He solves the problem. He's got all the tools, and in solving the problem, his ego is boosted. He also gets to think, I can do science because he's got all the tools to do the problem. So his success reinforces success because of the teaching method. So this is what I consider important. Past papers not studied. In both good and bad schools, past papers are studied. That's not important, but it can help. Testing and remedial action. This is another important thing. In the underachieving schools, I have found that there's very little individual work being done. In other words, you find a few good students working through past papers and giving the answers to the other students. So you do not find that there's emphasis placed on the individual to solve problems for themselves. Basically what they do is they have this group learning or Ubuntu learning or whatever you want to call it, where everybody sits around, tries to solve the problem in a group, and basically the best student is doing it, and the rest are copying his answers. Then the teacher will revise the answer at the end on the board, but there's no systematic teaching. And for the whole year long, a student can get by without actually doing and solving problems for themselves, which is the whole basis of physical science. So all the weaker students are getting away through the whole year without being tested and remedial action taken when they can't actually solve the problem. So this is a huge factor too, and it has to do with homework, because homework, you have to do it on your own. Again, it forces you to do some work for yourself. So that ties up with that, but you have to have the thing systematically taught before you can do the homework. So if it's not systematically taught, the kids will come back and say, look, I don't know how to solve the homework. And they're quite correct. Because it hasn't been systematically taught, the teacher cannot demand that they do homework. So you'll see that these things somehow tie up. Now, outside support, I found even that at the worst schools, there's lots of outside support. There is at the good schools too. Parents, I would imagine parents are passionate about their kids passing in both schools. So you may find in the better schools they will not tolerate, the governing body will not tolerate a subject failing all the subject. They will want that teacher fired or changed or something. So parents may play a role. What about individuals solve problems for themselves? That is vitally important. Group learning is fine. Outcomes-based education also focused a lot on that. And I feel that was a huge mistake. In the underachieving schools, individuals do not solve problems for themselves. The best student seems to do all the work. So this is a very important thing, and it's done through homework, it's done through systematic teaching. You must teach to the level where the students can solve the problems, then spend the rest of the half of the lesson. So you teach for half a lesson and allow the students to solve the problem for the other half of the lesson. And if you have break after the lesson and they haven't solved the problem, you keep them in a break till they've solved the problem while you help them. So you force them to do some work. And this creates a little bit of friction between the teacher and the learners, which you do not find in underachieving schools. Oh, everything's so sweet and wonderful and light and pleasant because the teacher's not applying pressure on underachievers. So this is very important. Practical work not being done at underachieving schools. They are frightened of science. The teachers have not done practical work. When they went to school, the teacher never did practical work. Very important for fostering a true love of science. No practical work done at underachieving. Facilities, printing, labs. These underachieving schools have got great labs. They've got great printing. So this is not a factor. What about teachers underqualified? Well, that is not a problem, except the teachers are not taught how to teach at the teaching institutions. They're not told thoroughly spoon feed and teach from A to Z the whole problem before you give your students, set them off to solve problems for themselves. They are incorrectly taught because I've watched those teachers. They haven't a clue about proper teaching. So I can blame not so much the teachers. The teachers are doing their best. They don't know why their students, in spite of all their hard work and efforts, are not underachieving. So it's not that they're underqualified, it's just they have the wrong method. Learners made to feel inadequate in underachieving schools. This is so true, and it's because of the teaching method that is not correctly applied in the underachieving schools. Learners given all the tools before being asked to solve problems, that is important. It's not being done at underachieving schools. What about the role of the teacher? Well, you can have all the intervention you like. It still boils down to you put a good teacher in a bad school environment, he will still or she will still produce results. It all boils down to the teacher. There's very little that external influences can do. And we've already discussed the history, that is the generations. So for South Africa to really do well, we need students that come from good schools to go back into the underachieving schools. where they have a love of science, where they're used to working with practicals, where they can speak the home language of the learners, and that way they could bring good methods to bad schools.